Left 4 Dead 1 and Left 4 Dead 2 are insanely similar. Obviously. They're literally two games in the same series published by the exact same company. Left 4 Dead 2 is understandably billed as a sequel to the original Left 4 Dead, and with that title, most would assume it's meant to be a continuation of the blueprint that the first game laid out, but that isn't actually the case. The second entry is a lot less of a traditional video game sequel, and a lot more like Valve giving the exact same game another try, but this time with an even bigger budget and an even bigger team. I think it's pretty clear that the goal with Left 4 Dead 2 was never for it to exist alongside the original game. It was pretty much always meant to replace it, which is exactly what it did the second it made its way onto store shelves in 2009. Even today, Left 4 Dead 2 is the main hub for Left 4 Dead. There's pretty much no reason to buy Left 4 Dead 1 on its own, and frankly, nobody even really plays it anymore. Which isn't a problem, because just about everybody unanimously agrees that Left 4 Dead 2 is the superior game in just about every perceivable way. But is Left 4 Dead 2 actually that much better? It's easy to look at the two games and declare the second one the clear winner, but I think that question is actually a bit more nuanced than most people might think. Yes, Left 4 Dead 2 has more official support from Valve, more updates, more content, and more players, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a better game. It just means that it got more attention. Today, I'm going to do my best to fairly, and hopefully pretty comprehensively, determine once and for all which Left 4 Dead game is better. Left 4 Dead 1 versus Left 4 Dead 2. So without any further ado, allow me to scrutinize two 15-year-old zombie video games to find out which one is the best 15-year-old zombie video game. Let's get into it. The characters are the most important part of any Left 4 Dead game. They help the player understand the world the game takes place in, long before they even have a chance to start playing in it. Left 4 Dead's cast of characters are one of the most essential pieces to crafting the game world. After all, the idea is that they're four random people plucked from random places in this giant universe, so they act almost as a sampler meal, giving you a small preview of the various types of people that inhabit it. Or, I guess, used to inhabit it. As weird as it might sound, a good Left 4 Dead cast is ideally kind of just boring. They shouldn't feel like generic sidewalk NPCs, but they also shouldn't feel too much like a video game protagonist. They're more or less supposed to be mundane, ordinary people, and that's what makes the cast of both games so special. Look at Left 4 Dead 1's cast. They're all believable, somewhat normal people who you wouldn't really be surprised to see in the real world. You could argue that Bill and Francis are both generic tropes, considering one is a grizzled veteran and the other is a biker, but those are both tropes that exist in the real world, and if anything help to make the cast feel even more realistic. Sometimes random people are just veterans, or random people are just bikers. The cast of Left 4 Dead 2 is pretty much the exact same as the first, albeit a little less generic. Both games have an authority figure, an optimistic everyman, a shady criminal, and an inexperienced woman. So, how do the two similar teams stack up against each other? Obviously, which set of survivors you prefer really just comes down to personal preference, and there's tons of nuanced opinions you might have about each group, but for the most part, I think what determines what group is better is which one is more believable. Both groups are pretty normal and can easily exist both in our world and in the established world of Left 4 Dead. There's really nothing too crazy about them, except for the fact that they can get their heads smashed in by a tank and not die, I guess. That's pretty crazy. If I had to pick, I'd say the Left 4 Dead 2's characters are just a little bit more realistic. Both groups rely pretty heavily on pre-existing tropes and cliches, but I think Left 4 Dead 2 fleshes them out just a little bit more. Francis, as interesting of a character as he is really at the end of the day just kind of a generic biker guy. His counterpart though, Nick, is much more complicated. He's a degenerate gambler, convict, and kind of ambiguous. The implication Valve was going for is that he broke out of prison when the zombie infection started, stole a suit in order to replace his prison clothes, and then just started killing zombies. But then again, what if he's just a regular old con man? It's hard to say because his character actually has some sort of depth to him. Both Francis and Nick are clearly meant to read to the player as criminals, but I think it's pretty undeniable that Nick is much closer to the type of criminal that you would see in real life. He's dressed pretty normally, tries not to draw much attention to himself, and presents himself more or less the same way anyone else would. Francis, on the other hand, Francis might as well be wearing a criminal Halloween outfit. This concept of the Left 4 Dead 2 characters being less generic carries over to basically all of the other three survivors as well. I guess if I had to think of a good way to put it, I'd say that Left 4 Dead 1's characters do their best to accurately represent a trope or cliche, like biker or veteran, while Left 4 Dead 2's characters try their best to expand upon and humanize classic tropes and cliches. Ellis isn't just a dumb redneck. He's a dumb redneck that clearly has a life beyond the zombie apocalypse, has interests, a social life, hobbies, and tons of stories involving his personal friends that he can and will mention by name at any given time.
One time, the army bombed my buddy Keith. I hear honey.
Left 4 Dead 2 characters feel a lot more grounded in the world. They recognize landmarks they're familiar with, stuff like Kittyland, Jimmy Gibbs Jr., the Midnight Riders. It's pretty easy to imagine the cast of Left 4 Dead 2 before the zombie apocalypse living out their everyday life. But by that same token, I think seeing Bill out of his army uniform just buying shit at the grocery store would be really weird. I could definitely see Coach doing that though. So with all of that said, I have to give the point for this category to Left 4 Dead 2. In my opinion, the cast is just much more well-rounded and way more believable. They're more or less just a different take on the pre-existing Left 4 Dead cast, but I think they're better written overall and frankly a lot more iconic. The goofy vibe they give off and the amount of humor present in the characters' dialogue probably isn't for everyone, and I think after 15 years the jokes might finally be starting to show their age, but they're easily some of the most interesting characters that Valve has ever written, and I personally think they have a lot more depth to them than even the Left 4 Dead 1 survivors do. Even if at times they might go a little overboard, little overboard with the use of humor.
Dude, this is just like Team Fortress 2.
This game is nothing like Team Fortress 2.
Also, just for the record, Ellis is Meatwad, Nick is Master Shake, Coach is Frylock, and Rochelle is Carl. The only other thing I can think of that are nearly as important as survivors in a Left 4 Dead game are the weapons in a Left 4 Dead game. Weapons, after all, are the only reasons the survivors are even able to survive, and without them the game wouldn't even be called Left 4 Dead. It would just be called Dead. The way Left 4 Dead 1 approaches its weapon arsenal is pretty interesting. While it's undeniable that it's very limited compared to Left 4 Dead 2, I think there's honestly a lot more thought put into the first game's weapons than the second one's. They aren't super extravagant by any means, and while you could definitely argue there's a severe lack of weapon diversity, they do feel very believable. Pretty much every weapon in Left 4 Dead 1 makes sense for the survivors to get a hold of, and the weapons they choose all reflect the survivors' personalities in some way. They're not just mindless weapons chosen because they look cool, they're extensions of the survivors. It would almost feel wrong to see Bill without an M16 in his hand. He's a combat veteran and fought in Vietnam, and it's a rifle he'd be extremely familiar with. The M16 is precise, it gets the job done, and it's efficient, just like Bill. The more inexperienced Zoe leans towards the hunting rifle, a weapon that is ridiculously simple to operate, and one that most people would be able to wrap their heads around in just a few short minutes. Francis' tendency to use shotguns is a reflection not only of his wild criminal past, but also a reflection of his personality as a whole. Shotguns are loud, brutal, and big as hell. They require zero finesse to operate, and the way they sweep through zombies is just as bullheaded and brunt as Francis himself. Lewis is pretty interesting. You'll often see him with 2 pistols in his hand. He's undeniably having way too much fun with the whole zombie apocalypse thing, and his choice to fight through most of it with 2 guns, probably because he saw it in a movie somewhere, is pretty reflective of the type of character he is, and also just how much he's enjoying breaking out of the monotony of his 9-to-5 to fight zombies. Look at this guy, he's having a good old time. Left 4 Dead 1's weapons are tactical, gritty, and loud. The models and sound effects reflect the dark atmosphere of the game as a whole, and even though they might be a bit unrealistic, they're extremely believable and fit into the universe perfectly. Left 4 Dead 2's guns, on the other hand, well, they aren't nearly as well thought out. Graphically and design-wise, the weapons might be better, I'll give them that. But they don't really feel like they belong in the universe that Left 4 Dead 2 tries so hard to establish. While the arsenal is undoubtedly much more diverse than Left 4 Dead 1's is, that diversity comes with a cost. And that cost is that the weapons are completely disconnected from the rest of the game in just about every way. Tactical assault rifles, grenade launchers, a light machine gun, an AK-47 for some reason. None of these weapons really have a place in the game world, and it's not really explained why they're there to begin with. They don't really reflect the personalities of the survivors in any meaningful way. I honestly think you could change out the entire arsenal without noticing any meaningful change to the atmosphere of the game, like, at all. Even Valve realized that Counter-Strike source weapons would thematically fit into Left 4 Dead 2 without disrupting it too much, so I think it's fair to say that as fun as they might be to play with, they're just bland. Weirdly though, I feel as if Left 4 Dead 2's melee weapons reflect the game's vibe way more than the actual guns do. Being able to wield a frying pan, or a katana, or an electric guitar to fight your way through a zombie horde is goofy as hell, and that's exactly what Left 4 Dead 2 is trying to be. If Left 4 Dead 1 is 28 Days Later, Left 4 Dead 2 is Shaun of the Dead. Valve clearly took into account the comical nature of Left 4 Dead 2 when it came to designing the melee weapons, and I honestly think the melee arsenal is the only saving grace when it comes to the game's weapons. Pretty much every melee weapon in the game has a purpose both in the world and thematically. The guitar is here because, well, it's a rock and roll concert. This frying pan is here because we're literally in the kitchen of a restaurant. This katana is here because this is probably like a fat guy's house or something. I actually don't know this one. They all have a reason for being where they are, and not only serve as a change of pace for the player during gameplay, but also act like props, helping to build the world, make it feel more real, and hammering in the goofy nature of the game that much more. So with all that said, which arsenal is better? Left 4 Dead 2 might have a lot more variety and make for a more enjoyable experience, being able to try out new weapons pretty much every chapter you make it through, while Left 4 Dead offers a much smaller, yet much more refined, arsenal. There's no melee, and the amount of limited guns at your disposal might be disappointing to some, but I honestly think its weapons are a lot more thought out, and reflect the game they're in much better than Left 4 Dead 2's do. So, I'm gonna have to give this point to Left 4 Dead 1. Again, this doesn't mean that Left 4 Dead 2's weapons are by any means bad, it just means that Left 4 Dead 1 offers a much more refined arsenal that I think are objectively better and much more thought out. So, yeah. Maps, or levels, are pretty essential to determining how basically any game will feel. Along with the characters, they're one of the most direct and obvious ways to convey to the player what vibe should be coming off of the game. Levels in Left 4 Dead 1 are either gray, grayish blue, or grayish green. The game is super muted and super dark, and it's made that way on purpose. It would be weird for such a comparatively grounded and gloomy game to not have grounded and gloomy maps. Expect a lot of rain, a lot of fog, and a lot of concrete. In addition to the dark vibes that Left 4 Dead brings, it also tries its best to keep the locations the survivors visit pretty grounded. I'd go as far as to say that the craziest place the survivors even go to is Mercy Hospital. Beyond that, the entire game is mostly just real-life places and businesses that you'd find in just about any city. Apartments, warehouses, gas station, farms, things like that. It's undeniably very realistic and it makes you feel like you're traversing through a zombie-infested state, but I don't know that it makes for better levels. Left 4 Dead 2 goes pretty balls to the wall and takes the survivors pretty much anywhere it wants for the sake of gameplay, even if the locations don't really make any sense. Amusement parks, malls, a plantation house, stores, a deep south voodoo-looking cemetery. Well, it definitely turns the cheesiness up to 11, and if you're someone who, for example, really likes the lifelike locations of the first game, then you probably won't like Left 4 Dead 2's Carnival, and you definitely won't like Kittyland. Left 4 Dead 2 undeniably has much more interesting locations than Left 4 Dead 1 does, but does that make it better? Honestly, yeah, it does. It just does. The highlight of Left 4 Dead 1 for just about anybody is Mercy Hospital, and that's because it's one of the most interesting locations in the game. If you can agree that Mercy Hospital is the best part of Left 4 Dead 1, you kinda just have to concede that Left 4 Dead 2's campaigns are better. The philosophy of Left 4 Dead 2 was pretty much to make every chapter its own Mercy Hospital. Even campaigns that on paper should be more mundane, like the Parish, end up being the highlight of what the series has to offer in terms of both gameplay and in level design. There's tons of cool ass stuff like having to go through a trailer or running across a broken bridge to get to a helicopter, moment to moment stuff that just makes the game a lot more interesting to play through than Left 4 Dead 1, even if it's a bit less grounded. So, yeah, this point goes to Left 4 Dead 2. As pretty and as cool as Left 4 Dead 1's maps are visually, I think just about anybody would agree that Left 4 Dead 2's maps are much better to actually play on. Now for the important question. How differently do these two games actually play? Well, not at all in some ways, and quite a lot in other ways. The core gameplay is the same between both games. You shoot a bunch of zombies, find better guns, and stop your stupid-ass teammates from falling off ledges as you try and traverse through the level. The big difference between the two games is the scale. Like I said earlier, Left 4 Dead 2 will basically just take what Left 4 Dead 1 did and dial it up to 11. This includes gameplay mechanics like set pieces, holdout sequences, story segments, and just about every other aspect of the game. Maybe it's just me, but the AI director feels a lot more sentient, so to speak, in Left 4 Dead 2. I felt like Left 4 Dead 1 kinda just randomizes the items that spawn on the map every playthrough, but Left 4 Dead 2's AI director actually feels like it makes coherent decisions about how to mess with the player at just the right time with the right special infected. I don't know if the AI director is actually improved in Left 4 Dead 2 or if there's just more shit for it to mess around with, but basically every playthrough of Left 4 Dead 2 feels about 10 times more dynamic than Left 4 Dead 1 does, in my opinion at least. Again, the elements aren't necessarily better, but they are undeniably more stimulating, and playing a video game is all about being stimulated, right? So it's pretty safe to say that Left 4 Dead 2 has better gameplay than the first game. This is kind of the hardest section to give an objective answer on, but I think that in a vacuum, most people would prefer Left 4 Dead 2's gameplay over Left 4 Dead 1's any day of the week. After all, most people watching this video probably played through Left 4 Dead 1 inside of Left 4 Dead 2 and not through the original separate version, so yeah, point for Left 4 Dead 2. Alright, pull up a chair and get real cozy for this part, because I'm about to embark on a ratlobber schizo ramble about the current experience of playing Left 4 Dead 2 in 2023. So, up until right now, I've been mostly trying to compare and contrast the two games as they were on release. But the truth is that they've changed a lot over the years, and the way the game plays and feels has changed pretty drastically as well. Starting off with Left 4 Dead 1. Despite some small changes to the source engine over the years, it's pretty much the same game it was on release, which, depending on how you look at it, can be either a good or bad thing. Yes, that is going to affect the player count. No, there's no way to play with crazy, wacky mods with your friends, and yes, you will be waiting like half an hour to get into a versus game. But the upside to that is, well, the game is exactly what it's advertised as. It's just Left 4 Dead 1. There's no extra content being forced onto the player, there's no confusing changes being made 15 years later, and there's no workshop available for people to fill with gigabytes and gigabytes of these little weird-ass anime creatures. Which is exactly where Left 4 Dead 2 falters a little bit. Don't get me wrong, I love the fact that Left 4 Dead 2 has years and years of updates under its belt, and I also love the fact that I can play Minecraft Left 4 Dead by basically just clicking on one button. But, like any game that's constantly updated over the years, it started to lose some of the charm that made people want to play the game to begin with. Over the years, Valve has added in cut content that doesn't belong in the game, community editions that probably shouldn't be in, and added in new voice lines that kind of undermine the original vision for what Left 4 Dead 2 was supposed to be. I'm all for adding in unused stuff to the game, but I don't think it should just be plastered all over the existing elements and forced to exist alongside them. It always struck me as weird. If you look at the Steam page, you're told that you're buying Left 4 Dead 2, but then you click play and hop into a random lobby, and you're not only playing on Left 4 Dead 1 maps, you're playing Left 4 Dead 1 maps with Counter-Strike source weapons or something. At some point you have to ask yourself, when is this too much? I feel like the original Left 4 Dead deserves more than to just be absorbed by Left 4 Dead 2, and I feel like Left 4 Dead 2 deserves more than to just share a space with maps that completely clash with the vibe that the game is going for. I don't necessarily have a problem with playing through the Left 4 Dead 1 campaign and Left 4 Dead 2, but it's important to remember that you're not actually playing these maps the way that they were intended to be played. You were never supposed to have melee weapons in these maps, you were never supposed to have incendiary ammo in these maps, and there definitely weren't supposed to be spitters, chargers, or jockeys in any of the original campaigns. I can't help but feel that honestly, it's a bit insane just how much content Left 4 Dead 2 has added over the years, with zero regard for how it affects the core game. If I'm playing on a Left 4 Dead 1 map with Counter-Strike source weapons and incendiary ammo shooting at chargers and spitters and I haven't even installed a single mod yet, then I'm not playing Left 4 Dead 2. I'm playing fucking Gary's mod at that point. Maybe not everyone's gonna agree with that, and maybe they will, but either way, I personally find that Left 4 Dead 1 might suffer from a lack of updates, while Left 4 Dead 2 suffers much more from too many updates. It's fine to add new content to an old game, but when there's no regard for how it might clash with the original vision, new content becomes less of a blessing and much more of a curse. Again, maybe not everyone will agree with that, and maybe that'll piss some people off, but I 100% think that in 2023, Left 4 Dead 1 is the only game that actually retains the original vision for what the series is supposed to be, and hasn't been bogged down and defiled by years and years of updates. So, yeah, points to Left 4 Dead 1. So with a final tally of 3-2, Left 4 Dead 2 takes the cake. I mean, it was probably pretty obvious to most people that Left 4 Dead 2 would win, but I mean, it has double the amount of budget that Left 4 Dead 1 had, and had Valve's full attention for an entire year. It was always going to win. I do think there's something to be said about the fact that Left 4 Dead 1 ever even stood a chance at all. This silly zombie game that was made by a tiny studio and started as a weird mod for Counter-Strike is somehow able to hold its own against a game that Valve spent 2.5 times more time and money making and marketing. The original Left 4 Dead undeniably has less content than Left 4 Dead 2 does. There's undeniably not much reason to consider playing it in 2023. But I also think it deserves a title other than worst version of Left 4 Dead 2, because that isn't at all what it is. It's a fully fledged, insanely well-made product with hundreds and hundreds of man-hours put into it. And even more than that, it's a time capsule. Untouched by updates, untouched by Valve adding community content into the game, and untouched by the workshop. When you play through Left 4 Dead 2, the experience you're getting is some weird bastardization of the original vision of the game on launch. Go play through the Xbox 360 version of the game or something. You'll be blown away by just how different it is from the modern Steam version. The first Left 4 Dead is I mean, obviously the only reason that the second one even exists, and without it we wouldn't have any Left 4 Dead games. So despite Left 4 Dead 2 being pretty undeniably more feature complete, I still have to give Left 4 Dead 1 major props for being responsible for not one, but two of the greatest video games of all time. Also, I think the Xbox 360 version of the Left 4 Dead 1 menu is like way cooler than any other Left 4 Dead menu. So, damn, I guess Left 4 Dead 1 was the best game of all. All along, it was the best game. That's crazy. Thanks for watching. I've been Ratlobber. Peace.
I think I speak for all of us when I say I understand why you folks might hesitate to submit to our demand. But here's an FYI, you're all gonna die screaming. All we wanna do is eat your brains. We're not unreasonable, I mean no one's gonna eat your eyes.